Welcome to this webinar session organized by Ahmad bin Khalifa University College of Law. I am Professor Damilola Olawi, and I will be moderating today's session. Today's webinar is themed Racism, Sustainability, and the Law. Over the last few months, the Black Lives Matter movement has sparked a lively discussion about the enduring problems of racism across the world, its various dimensions, whether overt or implicit, and how racism should be addressed have all been the subject of discussion over the last few weeks. This session will draw on legal principles and practices to better understand why eliminating racism is essential to the development of a sustainable society as contemplated by the United Nations 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. We're most delighted to welcome a wide array of distinguished experts from public and private spheres who will examine the role of law in addressing the problem of racism. We will be considering the topics from both the academic perspective and the practical perspectives. And I will be discussing the linkages between racism and the attainment of the SDGs across key sectors. We're also delighted to welcome Dean Amal Al-Maki, founding Dean of HBKU College of Humanities and Social Sciences, who will be discussing Arab perspectives on the problem of racism. Also with us is Dean Adrian Wing, Associate Dean for International and Comparative Law Programs at the University of Iowa College of Law, who will be discussing the role of international law in overcoming racism with focus on the obligation of national authorities and public institutions. Thank you, Dean Adrian, for joining us. We also have with us Deborah Majoras, the Chief Legal Officer, Procter and Gamble, who will be analyzing the role of the private sector in overcoming racism. You will agree with me that we have a very powerful roster of leading experts that will be helping us to understand the linkages between racism, sustainability, and the law in our society. Before we start, and in order for us to provide some context about today's discussion, may I invite you all to please watch this very short video that has been kindly put together by Procter and Gamble, which illustrates some of the overt and covert aspects of racism. All right, so I will just go straight into my presentation. But before I do that, I just want to remind us that we would be very glad if you can just keep your microphones muted so that we do not have interferences. And should you wish to interact with the speakers, please feel free to type in your questions using the Q&A tab in the screen. And we can address those questions to the panelists as we go along. And towards the end, we will take all the questions. My job today is quite simple. It is just to show the linkages between racism and the law and how it connects with the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, the starting point is to understand some of the key concepts. For example, what is the meaning of racism? And a good definition is that provided by Article 1 of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racism, which defines racial discrimination as any distinction, restriction, exclusion, or preference that is based on race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin, and of course, which has the purpose of nullifying or impairing the recognition or enjoyment of a person or a group of people. Simply put, it is any act of treating someone separately or differently or singling them out for a different treatment just because of their color or because of their race or origin. And the Durban Declaration, which followed the ICED Convention, recognizes some groups as groups that have been historically affected globally by the problem of racism, and that would include Africans and persons of African descent, Asians and persons of Asian descent, which will include West Asia, where we are, and indigenous peoples, migrants, refugees, minorities, and the Roma, Gypsy, Sinti travelers. These are categories of historically disadvantaged groups that this convention was seeking to protect. The next slide, please. And this chart put together by the Slow Factory Foundation sort of explains the 4 dimensions of racism. The first is institutional racism, which relates to institutions that have some sort of policies that reinforce discrimination or racist standards. So where it could include things like policies that sort of in a subtle way disadvantage people of racial backgrounds. So some of them might be clearly written, some might be hidden, but any practice in an organization that sort of limits the ability of people of color to rise in their career would come under the category of institutional racism. We have interpersonal racism as well, which would include microaggressions. Those are not written. They're sort of disguised or racially constructed barriers which limit the abilities of racially disadvantaged people to enjoy their freedoms, or freedom and liberty in the society. There is the internalized racism, which speaks of unconscious bias, the tendency to lump a group of people together and say all people from this country are like this, or all people of this color are like this, all people from this color are criminals, or all people from this color are very good people. By those sort of generalization, you tend to limit your ability to understand every individual from their own, from whatever they bring to the table. And the last is structural racism, and it is the most complex of them all because it sort of internalizes, it brings together all forms of racism and makes it a problem in the entire society. In the next slide, you'll see why structural racism is the most profound, because it is, like I said, brings together all forms of racism and leads to more discrimination. It includes when there are institutions or policies or approaches in place that tend to rewrite the history, the culture, the politics, economics, judiciary, and sort of integrate or ingrain bias into those systems. So structural racism, and we've heard a lot of people saying, oh, there's a need to address structural racism. And structural racism simply cuts across all forms of institutional, interpersonal, internalized aspects of racism, which have made our society difficult. And as we've seen from the protests over the last few months, you'll see that structural racism is I describe it as the antithesis to sustainable development because it's the direct opposite of sustainable development. While the SDGs are trying to ensure that we have a fair and equal society with social, economic, and environmental development, structural racism is the number one reason why the SDGs may be impossible to achieve. It includes, in the next slide, you'll see that structural SDGs, like I said, try to achieve three main things: economic development, and you see why. And you have SDG 1, no poverty; SDG 2, zero hunger; SDG 3, decent work. But you'll see why structural racism is the antithesis, because you have situations in which there's disproportional poverty rates when you look at those from racial backgrounds. You have situations in which there is uneven access to jobs. You have a situation in which there is uneven access to even basic necessities. And then we say we want to achieve the SDGs by 2030. You see that without breaking down this aspect of structural racism, it might be very, very difficult to achieve the economic pillars. When you look at the social pillars as well, you'll see that the social pillar in the next slide talks about things like health, good quality education, gender equality, affordable and clean energy. And you'll see that, when you look at what is on the ground, you still see situations in many countries in which people from certain backgrounds have to live in crowded conditions. Recent studies show that people in some Black communities, for example, have to pay higher costs of electricity. There's uneven access to healthcare. And for example, in the US, a recent study by the Centers for Disease Control showed that the pandemic has affected African American, Hispanic, and Latino communities more than any other group in the United States, due to pre-existing problems of inadequate access to health, inadequate access to energy. It's easy to say, oh, lock down, everybody stay at home. But a lot of people in these communities cannot even afford electricity to stay at home. So this has created almost an interlocking tile of problem for them, even in this lockdown. And when you look at the economic pillar as well, in the next slide, we see that the environmental pillar rather tries to achieve clean water and sanitation, responsible consumption, addressing climate change. Again, when you look at the indicators on the ground, a lot of studies show the prevalence of environmental racism, in which we have some toxic factories being cited in racial minority communities in different parts of the world. You have higher manifestation of asthma and upper respiratory diseases in minority communities. You have uneven access to drinking water, problem of climate change. And again, this reinforces the fact that how do we achieve the SDGs by the year 2030 without addressing some of these problems? For example, the SDG on energy says, oh, we want to achieve energy for all. But again, there are a few sections of the society that are unable to afford electricity due to the fact that they have to pay higher rates compared to other segments. And when you look at the next slide, which talks about some of the cross-cutting issues, having peace, justice, and strong institutions, SDG 16 and SDG 17 on partnerships, you see that when you measure what constitutes peace, justice, and strong institutions, you see that it is measured in terms of public participation, accountability, access to information, non-discrimination, empowerment, public awareness, what I like to call the panel principles. And when, again, you look at the institutions on ground, you see a lot of, you see how structural racism is affecting us, is not enabling us, rather, to achieve some of these SDGs, especially SDG 16. You have a case of racial and ethnic profiling, which has been reported in many parts of the world. For example, a recent study shows that, people with racial characteristics are 7 times more likely to be stopped and searched by the police in many countries. There is disparate treatment by prosecutors, disproportionately severe sentences, criminal charges, and of course, the one that has come under the spotlight lately, due to the situation in the United States, is the issue of police brutality, shooting, harassment, arbitrary detention, and abusive treatment of people of racial characteristics by law enforcement agents. And again, this shows that without dismantling these problems of structural racism, it will be almost impossible for the world to achieve any of the SDGs. And so, as I show in the next slide, what we need to do is to ask ourselves, how can we, and I put in this slide in order to ask the question, what should responsible governments be doing now? There's a lot of debate as to what should be the response of the United States to the protests. Some describe some movement of anarchists. Well, I don't know the agenda of any movement, but what I know is that in order to have, this is what we call the 5 levels of conflict intensity. In order to have stable peace in which there will be no protest, there will be no problem, a responsible government or organization or institution should in the first place put in place a policy that would avoid those problems. And the Durban Declaration says, in order to achieve stable peace with respect to discrimination, it is important for every institution to try and put in place good policies that will eliminate social, economic, that would eliminate discrimination in order to ensure that the benefit of social development, economic development, and environmental development are evenly distributed. That is the starting point for any institution for stable peace. Well, when stable peace becomes broken due to protest, as it is going on right now in the US and in many places, then the next thing a responsible institution should do is to try and achieve, try and reduce tensions, which is direct conflict prevention. Reduce tension, create trust, try and win back trust through dialogue, workshops, information sharing, and that could easily take you back to the condition of stable peace. When that doesn't happen, the next slide shows that if unstable peace then does not occur, the next thing will be there will be open conflict. There will be further destruction, violence, as you're seeing in the US, with many people pulling down, buildings and the likes, which is very unfortunate, really. But of course, for any institution, the next thing to do at this point is to prevent violence or further escalation through constructive engagement and third-party intervention, like having peace meetings and the likes, mediation, conciliation, listening to the concerns of the public and addressing them. If that doesn't happen, as this chart shows, it will further degenerate into crisis. And when there is crisis, according to this chart, which a lot of UN studies also back, then there will be a need to then deploy security forces and sanctions. And that stage is the last stage for you to achieve stable peace. If that doesn't happen, the next stage is war, which no society wants to see in order to then achieve ceasefire and peace. So it is very instructive that we should think very deeply about getting back to that very, very first stage, which is a stage of stable peace in which we can limit the dangers of discrimination by ensuring that we put in place robust policies and governance systems at all levels in public and private spheres in order to address and dismantle structural racism. Well, that will be my general overview. Now I will turn it over to Dean Amal to go ahead with our presentation. Thank you.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me today. Just like with the Me Too movement in 2018 that started from the United States and became global, the Black Lives Matter of 2020 has also reached the shores of consciousness of many nations where race and racism weren't previously discussed, at least overtly. The Black Lives Matter campaign that calls for the end of systematic racial discrimination has led to 2 parallel movements of solidarity across the Middle East and North Africa, the MENA region. One of these movements sympathized and condemned the practice, but claimed that it is a Western problem that doesn't exist in Arab and Muslim countries, because these countries are dictated by the Islamic doctrine, which is based on equality and justice. The second movement is a realist one that declared that racism is pervasive in the MENA region, just as it is in the rest of the world, and carries a historical baggage of slavery. And this movement called for exposing all practices of racial discrimination as a first step towards addressing the problem. We always need history to ground, but not to dictate our present. And thus, it's worth looking at racism from a historical perspective. This takes us back to the 9th century and up to the 19th century, when the slave trade was still practiced, kidnapping Black Africans and selling them as laborers and servants. to different parts of Arabia and North Africa. This has created a class division in these societies that diffused regardless of religious condemnation of racial discrimination. Slaves collocated with blacks, and inferiority became a descriptor that defines the blacks but also distinguishes the masters, the Arabs. The power relations were set based on racial and class division, and the conduct involved racial discrimination and violence. Racial violence took different shapes and forms, including physical violence. A very clear example is the sexual slavery, where black women were sold as sex slaves, which shows the double oppression for being a woman and black. Unfortunately, there are claims that this is still practiced in some parts of the region, especially within some monarchs. Racial discrimination and violence resurfaced through the Islamic history when blacks revolted against the exploitation, brutality, and oppression they are faced with. Yet these movements were mainly translated as political insurgencies. Slavery was abolished in the 20th century, with the exception of Tunisia being the first country to abolish slavery in January 1846, Qatar in 1952, Saudi and Yemen in 1926, and Oman in 1970 being among the last to do so. In the last 12 centuries, in the 12 centuries of practice, around 12 to 15 million blacks were brought into what is known now as the MENA region. Those descendants of slaves who later were freed and had become citizens of their countries, as well as indigenous native black populations such as the ones in North Africa, are example of how, for example, formed what some call now Afro-Arabs or Black Arabs. In addition to them, Black Africans migrated to Arab countries seeking equality and better living circumstances from countries like modern-day Zanzibar, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Sudan. A recent study by Stephen King in 2019 focuses on Black minorities born in North Africa. He states that they make up 10 to 30% of the population in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and the majority of population in Mauritania. Not to mention the influx of tens of thousands of Black African migrants. He emphasizes that racism in the Maghreb, North Africa, is peeking its ugly head again, and more forcefully so, and gives an example by saying Black people were being sold as slaves in at least 9 markets in Libya. When? In the late 2017. So, in forming the post-independence nation state, most countries with Black population who have become citizens of those countries and had their identities assimilated in an overarching national identity. Here, what happened is the histories of Blacks, as well as their daily struggles, have been erased. The legacy of racial slavery and oppression was marginalized, depriving them from their historical reference and excluding their histories and their lived realities from the overall national narrative. Another category that should not be forgotten when speaking about Black minorities in the MENA region is what has become to be called the modern day slavery, referring to the systematic exploitation by governments as well as individuals of Black, African, or dark-skinned Asians, or Asian migrant workers, I'm referring here. And I also emphasize here the intersection of race, gender, and class, leading to the exploitation of women working as domestic workers in specific. Horrific abuse stories have been reported recently during the COVID-19 pandemic from Lebanon and from other Gulf states. Now, the important question poses itself. Do Black Arabs face racism in their countries? Or are Arab countries colorblind or utopic? Well, of course they do. And the few documented inequalities are discrimination in employment and education opportunities, which clashes with their citizenship rights, social exclusion, pushing them to become subcommittees and minorities, so lower social status and standing, social normalization of racial discrimination, which spills over to social conduct, how we deal with them, how we interact with them, but also how we talk to them, communication, and how media reports all of that. Mixed marriages are strongly prohibited. lack of representation in leadership positions, lack of representation in government and in politics, lack of representation in media. All of this deprives them of having their voice heard and participating as equal citizens, and deprives the younger generation from role modeling. Unfortunately, we don't have enough writings or written about racism in our part of the world, so there is a need for quantitative and qualitative studies. Although there is a dire need to document the realities of people who are subject to racial discrimination in our societies, to expose these practices, governments should acknowledge that racial discrimination exists in our societies and have laws against it. Tunisia is a bright example. In 2018, Tunisia was the first country to enact an anti-racism law in the region. This came after a long history of civil society and rights groups calling for such a law to protect racial minorities. Um, I'm not sure about the time, but going back to the two movements in the MENA region that have expressed solidarity with the Black Lives Matter campaign, I would like to focus on those who have stirred a frank conversation about racism in our countries and called for exposing racism and, moreover, for ending our complicity through our silence. We can all start with small yet very important steps, like, for example, stop normalizing derogatory terms used to call blacks or dark-skinned people, to stop circulating racist jokes and racist mockery, monitor and report abuse of representation in media, whether traditional media, TV and press, or new media, social media. Now, I would like to end and maybe leave more to the discussion. I would like to end by emphasizing that we can't fix the problem that we don't acknowledge, and that racism is integrated in the cultural and social system, that it has become neutralized and normalized for those who practice it, but never for those whom it targets. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean Amal, founding Dean of the HBKU College of Humanities and Social Sciences. Of course, she needs no introduction. You know that she teaches courses on post-colonial literature and Islamic feminism. And we look forward to the Q&A to further engage with you. Next is Dean Adrian Wing, who is the Associate Dean for International and Comparative Law Programs and the Bessie Dutton Murray Professor at the University of Iowa College of Law, where she has taught since 1987. She also serves as the Director of the University of Iowa Center for Human Rights, and our expertise focus mainly on critical race theory, racism and American law, law in the Muslim world, and international human rights law. Dean Adrian has advised on the drafting of constitutions in 3 countries, South Africa, Palestine, and Rwanda. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Princeton, a Master of Arts degree from UCLA, and a Doctorate of Jurisprudence from Stanford. Thank you very much, Dean Adrian.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Dean Susan Karamanian of HBKU College of Law, as well as our wonderful moderator and chair of the panel, Professor Damilola, and also my fellow panelists, Dr. Amal and Attorney Deborah, as well as the facilitators of this event. It is an honor to be among you, coming from the University of Iowa College of Law in Iowa City, Iowa. We are located near Chicago. I wish I could join you in Qatar, which I have visited once before. I hope to see you all there one day, inshallah. At the start, let me say, I have had the privilege of life as an international lawyer and a tenured law professor and administrator in the United States for nearly 40 years. I have traveled to nearly 100 countries and met heads of state and well-known celebrities. As you heard, I have helped draft 3 constitutions, including Palestine Dastur, the Palestinian Constitution, and I have vacationed even at 5-star hotels. Nevertheless, I am an African American who is the descendant of slaves ripped from Mother Africa. We range in color from lighter than me to jet black. I have faced racial and gender discrimination every day. As the mother of 7 Black children and 15 grandchildren, I worry every day for their safety. 2 of my daughters, whom I have mothered since they came to Iowa as Ethiopian refugees. One daughter is Muslim and wears a hijab. She is currently in medical school in Chicago, and she has trouble every day, whether from fellow students, doctors, nurses, and even patients. No one can believe she is a doctor-to-be. Unlike myself, my husband is a dark-skinned Black man. People think he is from Ethiopia or Sudan. He has faced additional discrimination due to his skin tone and being a Black man in America. His very existence is often seen as evil and criminal, suitable to be treated like an animal, to be shot 7 times in the back or crushed in the neck, rather than the proud, brilliant, supportive artist, father, and grandfather that he is. We have just celebrated 40 years of knowing each other. I have friends from all over the world who I can stay in touch with through the glories of Facebook. Many of them watched this summer due to the racist events that have been globally televised. The death of George Floyd by the Minneapolis, Minnesota police, and many other deaths. The brutal retaliation against peaceful protesters supporting Black Lives Matter and other social movements. The white supremacist attitude coming from the very top of our government. The celebration of the long defeated Southern Confederacy and the protection of its monuments. The anti-immigrant and in particular anti-Muslim sentiments. The support of the most fascist elements that are undermining our very democracy, all in the shadow of out-of-control COVID, a disease which, as you heard, disproportionately affects Black and brown people. I have 11 family members in New York and New Jersey who have had this disease. 2 have died so far. In Texas, my son just married a Mexican American. She has 16 family members with this disease, and we from Iowa could not even attend their wedding due to the out-of-control situation. The protests that began in the United States this summer in more than 140 cities expanded to many other countries in the world, with denunciations of racism in those countries being trumpeted as well. In addition to the refrain, Black Lives Matter and I Can't Breathe, coming from the global streets, numerous businesses, universities, sports teams, governments, and non-governmental organizations issued statements pledging anti-racist behavior, new programs, and sometimes additional resources. This June, the United Nations Human Rights Council condemned the systemic racism against people of African descent. Members of families who had been recently affected by police violence went to Geneva and testified, and more than 600 groups were involved. Many of the things seen this summer are not new. They have been going on for a very long time. As a small child, I remember learning of the 1955 lynching of 15-year-old Emmett Till for allegedly whistling at a white woman, a claim that the woman did not admit was a lie until several decades later. I was too young to know that there have been thousands of such lynchings, and some may have even happened this summer and been dismissed as suicide. The difference today is that everyone now has a cell phone, and there is social media that can get information to go viral around the world in a very short time. Those cell phone cameras show what has been happening, including the lying about what is happening. Yet our justice system continues to protect the perpetrators and punish those who have been victimized. Very few police officers are ever indicted, much less convicted for their behavior. My topic for this webinar is the role and challenges of international law in overcoming racism, with the focus on the obligation of national authorities and public institutions. I specialize in human rights, especially race and gender issues, whether in the United States or in other countries. I have particularly focused on Africa and the Middle East in my work. International law, let us be clear, was mainly developed by white male elites in Western countries. It was the time of colonialism and slavery and the development of capitalism built on the backs of low-paid or free labor. The voices of the majority of the world's population were not acknowledged or respected. The majority did not attend the elite global institutions like Oxford, Cambridge, the Sorbonne, or Harvard. The principles that were developed were treated as objective and neutral, yet were built to ensure and justify the perpetuation of a status quo, ensuring Western elite dominance. We still live under that system, even though the majority of the world is no longer colonized and slavery is illegal. The study of racism remains marginal in international law. The major Western international law casebooks rarely mention the subject, and top journals like the American Journal of International Law rarely publish an article on racism. Instead, international law ends up consciously or unconsciously upholding white supremacy and hierarchy. The global community has been working to make anti-racist principles apply to the whole world and to expand them in the 21st century context. The United Nations 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, which we refer to as the SDGs, are part of that important process. The 2030 Agenda envisages a world full of universal respect for equality and non-discrimination between and within countries, including gender equality, by reaffirming the responsibilities of all states to respect, protect, promote human rights without distinction of any kind as to race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinions, national and social origin, property, birth, disability, or other status. In adopting the SDGs, the states have pledged that no one will be left behind and to reach the furthest behind first. The SDGs clearly focus on the needs of the poorest and most vulnerable. It is goal 10 of the SDGs in particular, which calls for a reduction of inequality in and among countries. The development of a sustainable society, which includes the fundamental dignity of all humans, cannot occur without the elimination of racism. SDG targets must be implemented by state parties and regional players in order to achieve sustainable development goals. Indicators are employed to monitor the implementation of the targets by state parties. The majority of the global monitoring indicators are harmonized across countries to ensure compatibility and comparability. The majority of these indicators are collected across countries. Complementary national indicators allow country-specific challenges to be addressed. Target 10.1 requires the state parties progressively achieve and sustain income growth. Target 10.2 aspires to empower and promote the social, economic, and political inclusion of all. Generally speaking, though, these SDGs do not deal adequately with intersectionality, which is the focus of a lot of my work. In other words, people face simultaneous discrimination, not just on the basis of their race or ethnicity, but also simultaneously with respect to many other identities. And I will list those that are in the South African Constitution that I helped draft. Those identities where you can have intersectional discrimination include sex, pregnancy, marital status, ethnic or social origin, color, sexual orientation, age, disability, religion, conscious belief, culture, language, and birth. And even this developed list does not explicitly mention class, being discriminated against on the basis of your class status, or what another one I call stature identity. This is how you look within your society. Those who meet the standards of beauty for that society do better in education, employment, and in all aspects of their lives. We must work together to make sure that these SDGs can come true. But as we know, they are goals. The main international treaty, which is the binding document, is ICERD, as you have heard, the International Convention on Eliminating Racial Discrimination. It came into effect in 1969. 182 countries are parties as of 2020. Notably, this important fundamental convention does not explicitly even define racism. Racism is more than acts of discrimination. Racism, as you saw from slides that Dr. Damilola did, is much more than that. It is an aggressive supremacist ideology. So it is much more than just an individual act, and it undermines the purposes and principles of international law, which are supposed to be peace, security, equality, and human dignity. CERD, like a number of the other human rights treaties, also includes an individual complaint mechanism, theoretically making it enforceable against parties. In reality, it isn't. In reality, you can't just arrest people and put them in some kind of global jail. Very few can do that. The International Criminal Court has done some of that, and they've been criticized about the racist nature of some of their prosecutions. I need to conclude now. I would like to close with mentioning my countryman's dream, the dream of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who died more than 50 years ago. He dreamed of an America where little black and little white children could play together in peace and harmony in Georgia. I'm here to tell you that unfortunately today, that dream still cannot occur in many places in the United States of America. I told you about those 15 grandchildren of mine. I have a global dream for them that one day they too could play with children around the world of different backgrounds, different religions, different creeds, and they could live in peace and harmony. They could live in an anti-racist world in a sustainable environment. Will that come true for everyone in the world by the time my grandchildren are grandparents? Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions. Shukran.
Thank you very much, Dean Adrian, for the powerful remarks and for the very insightful contribution. We look forward to engaging further on some of the points you have raised during the Q&A. I will turn it over now to Deborah Majoras, the Chief Legal Officer and Secretary of the Procter & Gamble Company, a globally represented corporation that specializes in a wide range of personal health and hygiene products. As we know, Procter & Gamble has also been at the forefront of using advertising to address social issues, including the video we just saw a few minutes ago. Deborah has a rich and broad experience in public and private sectors. Prior to her current role, she practiced law as a partner at the international law firm Jones Day, and then later worked with the United States government as the Deputy Assistant Attorney General of the United States Department of Justice, and then served as chairman of U.S. Federal Trade Commission. She has also served on the board of several organizations, including the Leadership Council on Legal Diversity Board of Directors. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Westminster University and a JD from the University of Virginia School of Law. Thank you very much, Deborah. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here with you so that we can have a good discussion on an important topic. I think dialogue is absolutely critical at all times, and certainly in this moment. Looking at the role that the private sector plays in overcoming racism, companies have long played a role in overcoming racism, but until recently, it was mainly an internal endeavor. After the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, increasingly large companies started to adopt equal opportunity statements and committed themselves that they would not discriminate on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, and other characteristics. And then, of course, with the rise of multinational corporations like Procter and Gamble, as we started to bring in our workforces from all around the world, obviously we were needing to integrate employees of different races, ethnicities, traditions, and cultures. But again, that stayed more as an internal matter. Today, though, large companies have changed the way we think about our role in social issues like inequality, really dramatically and pretty quickly. Why? Well, because first of all, we really are an important part of society, but also because our stakeholders are quite simply demanding it. Starting with consumers, in a recent Accenture survey of consumers around the globe, 62% want companies to take a stand on social, cultural, environmental, and political issues. And 2/3 believe that their actions in protesting, like boycotting products or speaking out on social media, can change how companies act. And not surprisingly, then, other large stakeholders like shareholders and governments, NGOs, customers, our own employees are calling on companies to take stands and to push forward on social issues. And again, it makes sense. We employ so many people who are not immune from any of the forces of the world, including racism. And of course, we're providing goods and services that are critical in people's lives. So what started as maybe a nice to do for companies with engaging in some charitable contributions and work has now turned into much fuller engagement. And so, for example, if you go to the P&G website, you will see how we use the SDGs ourselves to check on what we're doing to contribute to the greater global community. But a couple things we have learned as we've been doing this work as a company, we call it our citizenship work, and we have several pillars. The first is that it really needs to be part of the company's strategy. If it's not a nice to do, it's something we need to be doing. It needs to be part of the strategy, not kind of bolted on as an after the fact thing. And that also means that we do best, just like when we choose where we're going to do business, we are most effective in our citizenship work when it really hews closely to our equity, to our skill set, to what we know how to do best. So not surprisingly, among our citizenship choices, we have a pillar called equality and inclusion. And that was really a very natural choice for us because we've long strived to be a highly inclusive employer and partner to many of our suppliers. So what do we do then to try to help overcome racism? Well, it still begins within the company. To have a credible voice in this conversation and in this movement externally, we have to first be hiring, retaining, and developing our own diverse workforce, and then creating a very inclusive environment in which every single employee believes that she or he can come in, bring their full selves to work, be who they are, be accepted for who they are, and be able to excel and succeed. We have over 140 nationalities represented in our company around the world, and so that's a great start, certainly. But it's really only the beginning. Our hiring is very deliberate. We've learned that over time. If you want a diverse workforce, you must be very deliberate in looking for it. We don't discriminate in hiring against anyone, including in the majority. What we do is the classic fish where the fish are, right? So we go, for example, in the United States to historically Black colleges and universities to recruit, as well as recruiting minority students at other more majority universities. In your region, we promote female hiring in several different ways. We had a program, for example, in Egypt called She's an Engineer, where we worked with several universities there to try to recruit more females, and particularly into STEM fields like engineering. Then once people are in, obviously we're working to hold our leaders accountable for creating an inclusive environment. That is not easy. That is constant. That is a constant thing we are working on and understanding, because all generations are not the same, and what is inclusivity to some people is not to others, and so forth. So it takes work, and it takes training of our managers, and it also takes watching for bias, consciously monitoring for bias, whether it's in promotion, whether it's in pay, and in leadership, and then holding leaders accountable for that. And then the other thing I would say internally is making sure to create that room for candid dialogue. How are we going to have candid dialogue in our communities if we can't even have it with our coworkers? It's hard, it's difficult, but we need to be doing it. So what I would say internally is we're far from perfect, but we're working at this all of the time. Then when we go externally, it's how do we best use our equity? Well, we're the world's biggest advertiser. We have dozens of recognizable brands that people trust. We partner with thousands of suppliers around the world, including small businesses. We have some credibility with stakeholders like governments and NGOs, and we understand what it takes to be an entrepreneur. So what can we do with all of that? Well, let's start with advertising. You just saw the short film called The Look. That is bookended, if you will, by two other films, one called The Talk, which we first created, which was about what is the talk that Black parents in America have to have with their children about what they're going to face in the world. And that's remarkably consistent across economic strata. And really just getting people to understand that. And then most recently, after George Floyd was killed, we created very quickly an ad called The Choice. And the choice, it's the choice we all need to make, which is what are we going to do about this issue. So the purpose is to leverage our voice to shine a light on inequality in a very human way, to try to gain understanding so that we can actually be having the kinds of conversations that we really need to do. We've just created more recently a film called Two Evils, which really does look at how COVID has disproportionately impacted minority communities and what that means. Second, we use our brands. The Olay skincare brand has recently developed something called Voices of the Moment, where they're highlighting women who are fueling the current fight for civil rights in this moment. Pantene shampoo is traditionally known for beautiful Caucasian women with long flowing hair. And some of our very talented African-American scientists and others got together and created the Pantene Gold series. And we're highlighting the beauty of the hair of African-American women and how that challenges the norms of what so many have thought truly beautiful hair must look like. So those are some of the ways that we're using our brands. We've actually also used our brand Always recently to celebrate Saudi women who have achieved careers that have traditionally been challenged. We've highlighted these achievements with a social film created by an all-female Saudi cast and crew, including the director, producer, and so forth. And they're getting female Saudi viewers to post their own accomplishments as a result. So that's just a way that we adapt our brands to the regions in which we're working. And then just quickly, Supplier Diversity. Since 1976, we've had a program where we work very closely with women-owned businesses and minority-owned businesses in empowering them and breaking down barriers for them. Economic empowerment is, I think, a big one for companies. In your region, we're currently supporting female entrepreneurs through the Women's Entrepreneurs Development Program in collaboration with We Connect International. We're providing training and support to women who own businesses, and we've committed to spending $150 million on this program in the Middle East, Africa, and the Asia Pacific region of our businesses. In the US, we work with a company in our hometown of Cincinnati, with a company called Nehemiah Industries, which employs a huge number of former prisoners. People have a very tough time in their disproportionately minority getting back into the workforce when they leave prison, which leaves them in a terrible state in society. And so this group has taken P&G brands that we know are wanted or needed, and created a way to manufacture and sell these brands with this workforce. So it's just another way. Companies can't do it all. Companies are asked to do it all. Where are you on police reform? What do you want to do about this? What do you want to do about that? But we can help support groups that are expert in some of these issues that we're not, and we're doing that as well. The final thing I'll say as the company's chief legal officer is I've been asked over the years, isn't this really risky? I mean, you guys going out and taking these positions must be really risky. What if people don't like it? They won't buy your products. And that's very true. But my answer is that it's riskier to do nothing. It is imperative that companies are engaging. We are part of society, and we need to be in these discussions. We all benefit from stable, sustainable societies. And of course, at the company level, again, our stakeholders are expecting us to engage. Now, not all people like it. Some people come to us and say, some people even, occasionally even our company say, can't you just make soap? Why? Can't you just make soap? Well, when people, for example, I told you about the talk, when that video came out, some people were outraged by it. And they told us they were outraged by it. But we didn't cut and run. We didn't pull it. We doubled down. We showed it more because it was starting the discussion we felt we needed to have. I will say this, though. I think the biggest risk that I see in practice as we're working to overcome racism is that some see the overcoming of racism as an endeavor in which there will inevitably be winners and losers. That, to me, is an impediment to overcoming racism. We need to show people that actually equality, when we can achieve it, lifts everyone. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not, if you win, I'm going to lose. And that, I think, is really important to getting to where we need to go. And I see that play out on a micro level. So that is, those are just a few thoughts of many on how the private sector can and should be engaged in this very important fight. And so I thank you all and look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Deborah, for those wonderful and insightful comments. I think two things strike me from the very wonderful presentations we've had from the three speakers. One is that we cannot create truly global societies or workplace without diversity. And we cannot achieve diversity unless we are intentional about it. And I think the second point that came very strongly from Deborah's presentation is that when it comes to racism, there are three options facing everyone. Either we join and practice racism actively, or number two, we look away and do nothing about it, or we actively contribute to dismantling it. But when it comes to racism, it's one of those problems that you cannot sit on the fence. You belong to one of the three, and I'm delighted to see that Procter & Gamble has taken the third option, which is the option of contributing its resources to dismantling the problem. We'll go straight to the Q&A, and now that I still have the mic, I better use it and ask the first question. And I think the first question, while we wait for the other questions to come in, that I would like to ask will go to Dean Amal, which is, you talked about the role of social media in exposing racism and racial discrimination. And I was wondering, how can we, what is the role of social media really, and how can we leverage that in going to the path of actively dismantling racism?
Yes, definitely. Media plays a huge role actually in amplifying the voices of the marginalized communities. Now, social media in specific has been a double-edged weapon. It has certainly amplified the marginalized communities' voices, among which are the Black communities, by giving them a global platform, right, and a global audience. They were given a chance to expose the injustices in their own societies and the discrimination that they face, but it also gives space to racism and discrimination to flourish and repeat and be repeated and be circulated as well. So as an observer of recurrent and top discussions pertaining to social justice in our part of the world, at least on social media, and the college runs a program, a master's program on digital humanities. So we do that work in the program as well. I've noticed, for example, then that an overdue discussion about racism in our part of the world has been initiated, but it has been initiated by the younger generation, the educated generation, which gives us hope, of course, in the educated and the younger generation. And it resonated with celebrities and social media influencers, which is also good, but with very little participation from the intelligentsia, which poses a question mark. Why? Why? The reaction, of course, escalated between proponents who called for exposing racial discrimination practices and called for legislative changes and social activism to change, of course, people's mindset because it has been integrated in the culture, and between opponents who exercised denial and anger, exactly what Robin DiAngelo coined and described as white fragility. We saw it on social media as well. And you know, if we know, and we all know that white, you know, it's the way we think about racism and our self-racialization, because being white has become a system of privilege, right? In our country, it's creating a hierarchy of identities. It is usually the majority, the upper class, the superior race. So we've become all whites against the blacks, and this needs to stop because something leads to other things. It's a snowball effect. Social media is very important, but monitoring and reporting abuses on social media is also very important, and we have to play active role in doing so.
Thank you very much. There is another question here which says, what could be done to help people working in legislation, in lawmaking and in judiciary system to identify their own biases and intentionally eliminate it? I wonder if Dean Adrian will be willing to take that one.
Yes, of course it depends what country are you in, because each country will have different sets of national laws that relate to race discrimination or other types of discrimination. So, for instance, in the U.S. context, we have laws that are not only on the national level, but each of the 50 states can have local laws and policies. So right now, what's very, very popular in the U.S. is having a unit or an office in your corporation, in your university, that is now called DEI, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And so that's the name we use. We don't say affirmative action or any other prior name. We're saying DEI. So you can, if this possibility exists wherever you live, develop programs, and these have been developed all over the world, including by universities, by multinational corporations, that help you to educate the people in your system, whether they be employees or students or faculty or judges. In our country, we have jury system to help educate people about conscious and unconscious bias. And so it's not easy. They have done studies that show even when you sit people down and you give them like an hour PowerPoint, sometimes that can backfire. It can actually make some people be more racist or feel like they're being accused of being racist and not necessarily embrace what you're trying to do. But racism has existed for many centuries. We're just a moment in history. So we're not going to cure racism with our beautiful programs or videos or legislation. What we will be judged by is what did each of us do, right? What did each of us do in the time we had on the planet to contribute and to participate rather than be silent or be part of the problem. So don't get discouraged if your efforts get backlash or you get looked at as, you're this troublemaker who's trying to rock the boat, and you yourself are racist because you bring up that there's racism. And we have a big issue with this right now in the U.S. media and the U.S. government saying, don't use words like white privilege and don't use words like critical race theory because then you're a racist. And so academics who are on Twitter are now coming together to tweet about this when we're talking about social media. I'm not on Twitter. I don't know what's happening, but they're using that media to talk about, well, what is this dangerous critical race theory thing that allegedly the U.S. government is flooded with at this moment. But there's a lot that can be done depending, of course, where you're living.
Thank you, Dean Adrian. There are two. I'll take on. Yes, Deborah, you want to say something?
Look, I think that that Dean Adrian is right, that there are programs and it's a start. And one that we have found particularly effective is called Men Advocating for Real Change. Mark, is it? And people have really learned a lot by going through it. That started with gender bias. That's why it's called Men Advocating for Real Change. But it's really expanded to all bias. So so I think it's a start for some people. Dean Adrian's right. It's not perfect, but it is a start. And I think a lot of people have been really impacted by it in our company. But the other thing I would say is, you know, when we talk about creating diverse groups of people to work together, there's a magic that comes from people of different viewpoints and different experiences coming together to solve problems. But it's also, in my opinion, and it's hard, it's one person at a time, but it is, in my view, the best way to break down biases, because if you think, for example, that a certain category of people is, you know, if you say, oh, well, I think Mexican Americans are lazy, for example, or something, and then you're working alongside someone every day who's hardworking, creative, helping you solve a problem, that bias is awfully hard to retain over time, right? And so that's the other reason that we want diverse workforces, is because that we are breaking down those one person at a time, I believe, because I've seen it happening. So just a little input.
Yes, I totally agree. And there's a follow-up question for you on that, Deborah. Two questions, as a matter of fact. One is talking about how key is the role of the leader or leadership of P&G in this process of trying to dismantle racism. And secondly, there is a question about how do we ensure in the multinational company standardized, non-discriminatory, inclusive environment across different cultures and countries. I think the other one is about how do you take into account the different cultures that you have to sort of put into consideration when developing such policies?
No, great questions. So the first is that the role of the leader is absolutely critical. I mean, there's just no question. Our CEO, from our board to our CEO, and then all of the rest of the officers, and then through the company, David Taylor, our CEO, has to set the tone from the top and say, we will not tolerate racism and discrimination. But not only that, we're making it a priority to overcome it, and here are the things that we're doing, and he needs to be seen, engaged in this. And so, you know, how do you do that? Well, for example, when he's giving one of his, town halls or, a webcast to the entire company, because everything now is being done by webcast, pretty much, he can't just do special ones about equality and inclusion, right? He needs to make it part of how he's discussing the business and how we're going to succeed. And then there's the delicate balance that we as leaders have to strike between, if you are saying you want people to be able to show their diversity and show up at work as themselves, there are going to be some differences of viewpoint. And what we have to demand is not that everyone holds the same viewpoint, but that everyone is respectful. And we can't, I've had lots of discussions with employees over time who have worried about certain positions the company might take, and they come to us and they say, you as leaders are telling me how to think. And what I say is, absolutely not. I will not tell you what to think. And I want you to challenge us on our thinking, as a matter of fact. But what I will require, and what David will require, is that you treat all of our employees, your coworkers, with this respect, regardless of your, that we can demand as an employer, and we do. We certainly try to. Once again, not perfect, but we certainly try to. So tone from the top is critical, and then David holding all of us as leaders accountable for this. Let's face it, to most people, the company is your manager, right? People don't leave companies, they leave managers, right? And so making sure that our leaders are well-trained and sensitive and having conversations, even conversations where you're very authentic and honest and say, I don't know everything and I'm worried. I don't want to offend you. Tell me more about yourself, about your culture, about that. So holding leaders accountable is very, very important. As far as the different cultures point, that is an excellent point. And I think it starts with understanding one another's culture. So for example, we have just developed a program so that when people come to the US to work from other companies and cultures, we have a program now to teach them about the Black history and Black experience in America. Because sometimes people from other parts of the world have not understood that. And they've maybe said the wrong thing or done the wrong thing, and they feel terrible about it. But we know we need to do a better job teaching. And that's the case when we're working together around the world. So we're getting better at that. But I think it first comes with you have to understand the culture. Now, that doesn't mean you always can tolerate it. And that's the most difficult thing. So I have had cases, for example, of sexual harassment where someone says, well, no, in this country, that's okay. It's a funny joke. It's not so offensive to women. Well, that's not true because the woman reported it to us, right? And so so we do have to have standards of conduct for the entire company on what we're going to tolerate and what we're not, but we do also have to understand the culture. So I'm just going to tell you one just very quick story on this point, then I'll be quiet. So I was conducting an internal investigation several years ago, very important to the company from a law enforcement standpoint. And it was one of these things where it felt like, unpeeling an onion in terms of trying to figure out what really happened. This was in an antitrust investigation. And naturally, as we were asking questions, to someone in the US, as we were asking questions of employees, we were saying, well, what about so-and-so? Was so-and-so involved? And what we found was a number of our European colleagues didn't want to answer those questions. In fact, came back to us later and said, you are completely immoral for asking me this question. Why did they say that? Because having been so impacted by Nazi interrogation to talk about your neighbor, your Jewish neighbor, they were taught that you do not tell a person of authority what your neighbor is doing, even if it's the wrong thing. And so that was sort of an interesting thing. I mean, obviously, we understand something about European history and about that experience, but it never occurred to us that people would be thinking that when for us, it was very natural for us to ask a question about someone's coworker. So the first step is to understand it and then see how we can work that together with the standards that we do require as a global company.
Thank you very much. I think Ezedin has a number of other questions that he has gathered. Yes, I think we've answered the ones on this slide. There is one there, if you can go to it, Ezedin, which is for Dean Amal, which talks about how can we then change curriculum. Yes, what can we do at higher education, curriculum, teaching materials to enhance awareness?
Very, very good question. We need to decolonize our curriculum. Our curriculum and the knowledge that we have has been transmitted to us. It's, again, the white, the superior. Foucault, spoke about knowledge and power, and those who have power, who owns power, owns knowledge. So what we need to do is decolonize that to be able to decolonize our minds. We have internalized the sense of inferiority of the Blacks. And the funny thing is, we as post-colonial people, citizens, we oscillate sometimes between being the white and being the Black. And it's really interesting, and it's been documented mostly in literature, and you see it in our literature. The things that we can't speak about out loud, we see in literature, and I do invite the audience to read a couple of novels. For example, there's one for Layla al-Jhani, called Jahiliyyah, speaking about the prohibited love between Arabs and blacks. And there's another one by Jocha Al-Harthi, who won the Man Booker of 2019. Again, a very nice novel who spoke about slavery in Oman as an integrated part of the culture. So what do? We rewrite curriculum. We reclaim our history, our literature. We have Qatari studies. We have Omani studies. We have studies and departments that are about us, about our diverse histories, and within the national identity, we have to encourage everyone. We have to record oral history. Let me tell you a bit about the language and the importance of language and how it determines how we perceive ourselves. This shows you a lot. We talk about curriculum, but the mere words that we speak determines how we perceive ourselves and perceive others, right? So let's watch our language in relation to terms that we use to call others. For example, we have been calling non-Qataris and Qatar foreigners, al-Ajanib, foreigners. And it's a term widely used here to refer to others, non-Qataris. So whether they're Arabs, non-Arabs, Muslims, non-Muslims, blacks or whites, as long as they're non-Qataris, okay, they're foreigners. This reminds me of when I first went to London to study, and the first thing we had to go and do is visit the Home Office, the Aliens Department, where again the word alien refers to all foreign citizens. It's ridiculous, right? So racism is one of the first epidemics that have plagued humanity, and it started with language. So we have to be careful. But it has been created and circulated by humans and perpetuated by systems, one of which is the educational system that we've established as humans to build a false sense of prominence of some of us and dominance over others. So it's not an easy thing to decolonize the curriculum. This means that we have to create new knowledge by us, the previously colonized. But I think we've got enough people to at least start doing that. As Dean Adrian said, we won't fix the problem, but you know what? We have a role to play as humans, and we want to leave a legacy after we leave. So we should start doing that.
Thank you very much. I think we can take a few more questions. Yes, I think we've answered some of this pretty much. There is one, the last one there, we can reflect on it, which talks about the problems in international law, really, which seems to, there is no definition. Can we ascribe a definition to racism that would not undermine experiences or forms of discrimination? Maybe Dean Adrian can speak to that one. And there is the one, yes, the one after it is about if we are to combat and end racism through SDGs, how can we also fight racism that is so indoctrinated into the next generation by racists today? So after Dean Adrian, then maybe Deborah and Dean Amal can also give their thoughts on this second one. Thank you.
Yes, I actually would like to address both of the questions at once. Professor Derek Bell, who's passed away, wrote a book, The Permanence of Racism. It very well may be that we will always have racism. It will evolve. It may be that in a certain cultural context, one group are considered white, and in another country they're not. So that's the social construction of race. And so, for instance, in America, I'm a Black American. When I'm in South Africa, I was considered a so-called colored, in a middle category that doesn't legally exist anymore, but still has privilege. There's no easy, there will not be any uniformity to define this term, to define either race or to define the various types of racism. When I'm in Europe, people said, look at that Black person, and they were referring to Roma, Roma people, right? Who there's that disparaging word, gypsy. So this person saw them as black, and I'm looking at them as they're just white people here. And so the discrimination against this particular group is not necessarily based on their coloring, but on social, deeply rooted ideas about them. And so these are definitely all going to be things that are over many generations, and that, you know, our great-great-grandchildren will have a manifestation. Even if we're on other planets then and we have other types of entities that we're dealing with, there will still be racism or some ism, ethnocentrism against those different types of entities, even from other planets. So thank you.
Deborah?
That's a tough question, right? None of us, you know, Adrian's being so candid, which is terrific, because you can't really solve a problem if you're not going to be candid about it. And but I do think that we can do our part for today, and in each of us in our own way. It just requires, it requires, in my opinion, a couple of things. One is we have to stop screaming and we have to start listening. I mean, there's just so much screeching going on, and you know, I was listening to one of our political consultants last week, and he was talking about a lot of different, you know, cultural changes over time and how that's contributing to our political and social situation in the country today. And one of them is that people no longer watch the news or read news in order to understand what's going on. They do it to reaffirm what they already believe. And so you end up with people very, you know, over here screaming about this and here screaming about this. And for me, I think actually, if we're going to overcome this, we have to do more listening, and we have to give people some grace. And I think that is just lost, at least in our society in the U.S. right now, because when people are so afraid to open their mouths about anything, they're just going to be shot down. If they ask the wrong question, they could be branded a racist. If they try to say to somebody, here's why I think you need to understand about white privilege, as Adrian said, then that is considered racist. I mean, we have to stop this. We have to be able to have this conversation. And that requires that, I believe, that we have to give each other some grace to be honest and authentic about this, so that we can start to get to the common ground part. Because right now I'm very concerned that we're not doing that and we're moving in the wrong direction. So what I always tell my people in my organization is that when things start to seem way too big, and I just want to like get back in bed and put the pillow over my head and not deal with it anymore, it's too much globally to think about, even nationally. I think locally, right? I go back to the Legal Aid Society of Cincinnati, and I work for equal justice for people in the city of Cincinnati who desperately need it, right? Because that may seem small, but if everybody's doing that in their communities, right, it gets big. And so that's the only way that I really know how to think about this when it gets to be too big and too scary.
Well, I think in terms of final reflection, one thing I hope we can, and I'll go around, you know, and ask for your sort of parting shot in terms of, we all seem to agree that the only way forward is to adopt some sort of good faith efforts and the use of targeted approaches, whether it is targeted recruitment or targeted efforts to ensure that we increase the diversity of our respective industries. So I wanted to know, you know, I know Deborah will be able to speak from the perspective of the private sector, and Dinama will be able to talk about academia, university, and Professor Adrian will be able to share, or Dean Adrian rather, will be able to share perspectives on the role of government in terms of a takeaway message in all of this. Thank you.
Thank you. I would say that we need to have conversations. We need to start such conversation in academia within our societies that shy away from speaking about race and racism. And shying away is actually making them complicit, basically, making them, being silent about the problem doesn't solve it. We really need to acknowledge the problem, and we need to admit to ourselves and to others within our societies that sexism and racism, who come really hand in hand, okay, exist in our societies, and we have to address it. So first, within academia, having to discuss it, involving the youth and the younger generation, because it's very, very important to listen from them. They are the ones who will lead our future, and we don't want a generation that feels oppressed by race as much as they're oppressed by other things around them. And the slightest I could say right now, mobility, right? Where we're oppressed by being indoors. So not shy away, face it. As I said, decolonize our curriculum, make sure that the SDGs, and this is something that I think any university, any educational system needs to do really, again, to meet the SDGs. We need to make sure that our curriculum builds the mentality that would celebrate gender equality, would celebrate equality, racial equality, and other types of equalities and justices, and teach the individual and teach the society. I think this is what I can say right now, and we could do it jointly, and we can keep the conversation going. Thank you.
The role of government. The role of a government leader is critical, just as we heard for a corporate leader or for an academic leader. Everyone listening is a leader of some type. It could be in your community, it could be in your family, it could be in many organizations, including faith organizations. And we all must view ourselves as leaders, as mentors, as role models in this struggle. If a boot is on your neck, you may not be in a position where you just want to have a nice little conversation. But to change that boot on the neck requires leadership and being able and willing to get that leadership to say that, okay, we will help stop this sort of behavior for our society. So I hope everyone, no matter what roles they play in their day-to-day lives, sees themselves as a leader, including of their own children and grandchildren and other people around them, and makes that commitment, as I said in my talk, that we're in a struggle. It is a struggle, it's multi-generational, and we cannot give up no matter how overwhelming it is. We have to think of our ancestors, our heroes and our sheroes who met that standard and commit as they did to this struggle. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. You've all given me some great food for thought here too. Look, conversations are two-way, and I'll say it again, they require listening, and that requires giving people grace to be able to say what's on their minds. If we don't have the honest conversation, then I don't think we're going to get off square one in our hard work that's ahead of us. The other thing, though, is sometimes we get in the trap of thinking that we have to have these conversations, come up with the perfect plan. And trust me, I work for a company that comes up with lots of perfect plans and lots of great PowerPoints and things, and mostly they're very useful, but this is going to be messy, and we have to act as well. So we don't have the time to just wait. The conversations need to be ongoing so we can gain understanding of one another and what's before us. But we need to be acting in the same instance, because what we know, for example, is the way that racism has contributed heavily to lower economic status for people, and those are basic human needs. And so we need to be addressing those. And people are so worried that this moment in the U.S. will pass because something else will overtake our attention. And so we need to put strong roots in the ground right now about actions we're going to take, which will change over time as we learn, but we need to get going lest we lose the momentum.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Thank you, Dean Amal. Thank you, Dean Adrian. It's been such a wonderful session. We've had very remarkable contributions, and your insights have been greatly enriching. And I think it gives all of us more to think about in terms of the roles we have to play as individuals to dismantle all forms of racism. And I think it's only fitting for me to invite the Dean of the College of Law, Dean Susan Karamanian, to express our sincere gratitude on behalf of the entire college.
Thank you so much, Dr. Damalola. The first group I'd like to thank, in addition, of course, I will get to our wonderful panelists, our students. This session came about because over the summer, Dean Amal had spoken on the subject, organized a colloquium, and one of our students wrote and said, we as the College of Law need to be engaged. And actually, Dr. Damalola he has his own video on this dealing with structural racism. And at that moment, he and I spoke and we committed to putting this wonderful panel together. So a big thank you to our students who are always out on front and thinking about what we need to be doing and the like. I would, of course, like to thank each of the speakers for what I consider to be a very provocative and engaging session. Dean Amal El-Maki, thank you for the historical perspective and for giving us the insights here in the region. And these are things I think about a lot, of course, when I walk down the streets and see the different nationalities in Qatar. Dean Adrian Wing, always a pleasure. We've known each other for almost 40 years now, but to hear your perspectives on international law, but the historical perspective in the United States, yet also the personal family dimension. I think each person who listened to this will remember that, take it to heart. And Deborah Majoras from Procter & Gamble, it's such a wonderful chance for you to be part of the HBKU community, to learn more about Procter & Gamble's commitment to dealing with the challenges of society and the way in which Procter & Gamble has dealt with racism. I've watched the other videos you mentioned too, and they're incredibly powerful. But thinking about power itself and the ability of a corporation to change culture, and this does lead into Dr. Damalola's comments. Thank you so much, Damalola, for chairing the panel and giving us also your substantive insights, both in the context of international law and the Sustainable Development Goals, but clearly also dealing with the issue of structural racism. Finally, I would like to thank my colleagues at HBKU who have helped put this together. We have a wonderful team that has worked hard to make this possible. We wish we could stand up and applaud them. But first, my colleague, Professor George Dimitropoulos, who chairs our events committee. Secondly, the head of our activities and events, executive coordinator, Sandy Amanis, and then finally, our webmaster, our communications expert, and the like, who has helped us through a lot on this program. Azadine Abdinati, thank you so much to each of you. Yeah, big round of applause to everybody. And finally, to the audience for your wonderful questions, your engagement. This is what we love to do here at HBKU Law, is to look at cutting edge issues and to get perspectives from around the world. And as Deborah said, an important aspect of this is listening. And so through listening today, at least I have become even more inspired to think about ways in which I can help tackle this very serious problem. So thank you so much, and everybody have a good rest of the day. For us, it's a good evening. I know some of our students have to go back to class. Some of my colleagues have to teach, and I know that many of you back in the States have back to either teaching or managing a legal department. So thank you ever so much.